The night was neither kind nor cruel. It simply was a vast indigo ocean that pressed against the windows of the city like a mute witness to every private war being fought in silence. Somewhere on the 23rd floor of a glass tower that reflected the moon in fractured shards, a man sat alone at a desk of black walnut, the grain so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His name is unimportant. Names are handles for other people to grab, and he had long ago filed his down to a smooth, ungrippable surface, but those who had studied his trajectory through boardrooms, courtrooms, and dimly lit backrooms called him the cartographer, because he drew maps of power that others only discovered once they were already lost inside them. Tonight he was sketching nothing, merely watching the slow swirl of smoke from a single stick of sandalwood, letting the threads coil upward like signals from a battlefield he had already left. The cartographer understood what the old Florentine had written and what the rapper from Harlem had rhymed. The person who commands your pulse rate can write the story of your collapse without ever touching a weapon. He had learned it first as a boy when his mother's tears persuaded his father to sign away half a company, then again in college when a girl's wounded silence made him question a friendship that had taken years to build. Each time he had felt the ground tilt under his feet, not from violence, but from the simple, devastating leverage of an emotion he had failed to leash. He opened a notebook bound in charcoal leather, so soft it felt like skin, and on the first page, already crowded with diagrams of circles and arrows, he wrote a new axiom in the same iron gall ink he used for contracts and for last wills. They do not need to break your bones. They only need to make you flinch. Then he dated it in the margin, not with the day's calendar date, but with the number of days since he had last allowed anyone to see him bleed. 371. A good run, but not yet a dynasty. Somewhere down in the street, a siren doppled past, a mechanical howl that faded into the hush of tires on wet asphalt. The city was always rehearsing loss. He turned the page and began to write in paragraphs instead of bullet points, because prose is harder to weaponize and therefore safer to leave lying around. Imagine, he wrote, that the mind is a cathedral you have built stone by stone since childhood. Every altar is a conviction, every stained glass window a memory lit from behind by longing or fear. Now, imagine visitors come, not worshippers but saboteurs, who carry neither torches nor crowbars but only small tuning forks, calibrated to the exact pitch of your shame, your rage, your secret wish to be loved. They strike the fork, hold it to the pillars, and watch hairline fractures bloom. You think the danger is the sound, but the danger is the resonance. One sustained note in the nave can bring the spire down. The trick, then, is to become an acoustic engineer of your own inner space. Dampen the surfaces, scatter the echoes, install trapdoors in the choir loft so that no single frequency can find a sympathetic string. You do not silence the bells. You learn which ones to ring yourself and which ones to muffle with velvet before anyone else can strike them. He paused, listening to the building itself, the faint click of the HVAC, the elevator cables humming like distant bees. Every system, he reminded himself, is a metaphor for another system. He turned to a fresh page and wrote a heading, on becoming unreadable. Beneath it he began to narrate, not as a teacher but as a cartographer mapping terrain he had already crossed at night and alone. Picture the moment when the insult arrives, wrapped in the tissue paper of casual conversation. Someone says, in front of colleagues who matter, that your last initiative failed because you overreached. The words are less than a gram of breath, but they land like mercury, seeking the cracks. The old circuitry sparks, cheeks flush, pulse accelerates, the throat tightens as if a fist is closing around it. In that instant, 1,000 possible futures fork, some loud, some silent, all expensive. The untrained man chooses one at random. usually the one that feels most righteous, and in doing so hands the map of his psyche to whoever asked for it. But there is another way. You let the mercury bead on the surface. You do not tilt the table. You inhale once, slowly, as if sampling the air of a country you might invade later. Then you smile. Not the wide, conciliatory smile that begs for reconciliation, but the thin, courteous smile a chess master offers when he sees the blunder 3 moves ahead. You say only, "Interesting," and let the syllables hang in the air like a question mark that has no intention of becoming a sentence. Already the power has shifted. The aggressor is now carrying the weight of your unread silence, and silence properly deployed is heavier than any retort. The cartographer lifted his pen and flexed the fingers that had once gripped a rifle stock in another life. He had not fired a weapon in 15 years, yet the muscle memory persisted. Align the sights, exhale halfway, squeeze without anticipation. Emotions, he had discovered, obeyed the same mechanics. You did not suppress them. You sighted through them. You exhaled the need to be understood and squeezed the trigger of deliberate quiet. He continued writing, the ink unfurling across the page like dark water. There is a lie sold in pastel colors from every screen, every self-help paperback, every anthemic chorus. To feel deeply is to live fully. To cry loudly is to cleanse the soul. To bleed on the public square is to be brave. But ask yourself, who profits when your tears become content? Ask who owns the platform where your breakdown is monetized by advertisers who sell scented candles to soothe the very outrage they helped ignite. The lie is not that emotions exist. The lie is that they must be displayed to be real. In truth, an emotion undisplayed is not an emotion denied. It is an emotion reserved, distilled, kept in a private cellar where it ages into something that can be uncorked for effect, at the precise moment when its bouquet will disorient an opponent. You do not need to be heartless. You need to be cardiac stealth. You still pump blood, still feel the quickening when beauty or danger appears, but no stethoscope pressed to your ribs will reveal the rhythm. That is the difference between empty and encrypted. He turned the page again and began to sketch a cityscape in miniature, rooftops at dusk, each one a vantage point for a different kind of watcher. Above the skyline, he wrote, "The predator's advantage is always height." Then he returned to prose. Consider the architecture of fear. Most people think it is built from external threats, loss of job, loss of love, loss of reputation. But those are only the facades. The true structure is internal, the fear of being unseen, of being misread, of being ordinary. The emotionally dangerous man does not demolish this building. He occupies it and remodels it room by room. He converts the basement of shame into a vault where leverage is stored. He turns the attic of longing into an observatory where he can watch others orbit their own desires. And he installs soundproofing everywhere so that no cry from the street below can reach him unless he chooses to open a window. This is not cruelty. It is conservation. Every watt of emotional energy you spend defending your reputation to strangers is a watt unavailable for the silent campaign you are waging toward a future they cannot yet see. The sandalwood had burned down to a slender ember. He lit another stick without ceremony, as if feeding a small engine that powered his thoughts. Smoke rose again, this time forming an almost perfect helix before the air conditioning shredded it. He wrote, "The first discipline is the pause. Not the dramatic, cinematic pause that signals gathering storm, but the microscopic pause between stimulus and response, the pause that exists in the space of a single heartbeat. To lengthen that pause is to lengthen your life, because every second you do not hand over is a second you still own. Practice it in low-stakes environments first. When the barista spells your name wrong, when the driver cuts you off, when the text arrives that says, 'We need to talk.' Each time you insert a deliberate beat, you are laying brick in the inner fortress. Eventually, the pause becomes reflexive, and you will find yourself living in that expanded corridor where choices breed like rabbits in the dark. Only then do you understand that free will is not a gift but a muscle, and most people let it atrophy because constant reaction feels like living. He remembered the first time he had tested the pause in earnest. A rival CEO had summoned him to a glass-walled conference room and spent 20 minutes detailing every rumored failure of his company, each accusation wrapped in the oily concern of false friendship. The old version of him would have counterattacked, would have produced spreadsheets in a theatrical flourish, would have allowed the afternoon to devolve into a shouting match that the lawyers could later bill by the hour. Instead, he had listened, nodded once, and then, just as the rival leaned forward in expectant triumph, he had looked at his watch, said, "Thank you for the feedback," and walked out. No handshake, no rebuttal. By the time the elevator doors closed, the rival's victory had already begun to sour into bewilderment. 2 weeks later, the rival overextended on an acquisition, partly because he had grown accustomed to opponents who telegraphed their moves. The cartographer had not caused the overextension, he had merely declined to interrupt it. The notebook filled. He wrote of the face as battlefield, how every micro-expression is a semaphore flag that can be read by anyone trained to look. He described exercises, standing before a mirror for 10 minutes each morning, cycling through imagined provocations, betrayal, mockery, seduction, and watching for the betraying flicker at the corner of the mouth, the tightening at the jaw. Then he described the counter-training, relaxing those muscles one by one, until the reflection became a mask that revealed nothing except what it was instructed to reveal. He wrote of voice modulation, of how to drop the pitch by 1/3 of an octave when issuing a command, so that the words lodged in the listener's spine rather than their ears. He wrote of silence as an instrument, how to let it stretch until the other person filled it with self-incrimination. But he also wrote of the cost. Emotional mastery is not a clean surgery, it is a series of grafts that sometimes fail. There are nights when the fortress feels less like protection and more like quarantine, when the absence of reactive noise reveals a deeper silence that hums with ancestral grief. On those nights he allowed himself a single glass of something peaty and expensive, the taste of which reminded him of peat fires in a country he would never visit again. He drank it slowly, counting the seconds between sips, using the ritual to remind himself that control extends even to pleasure. Then he corked the bottle and went back to work. He wrote of the myth of authenticity, that modern deity whose worship demands public confession as tithe. Authenticity, he argued, is not the same as transparency. A diamond is authentic even if it hides its flaws beneath facets. The moment it becomes transparent, it ceases to be a diamond and becomes mere glass. Likewise, a man can be entirely authentic in his refusal to display every tremor of his inner landscape. The most dangerous wolves are not the ones who bare their fangs, but the ones who walk among the sheep wearing the same wool, their authenticity undetected because it is not theatrical. He wrote of the strategic deployment of honesty. Tell the truth at precisely the angle that refracts the light away from what you are protecting. The truth is a blade. Only fools flail with it. Masters use it for surgery. He turned to a fresh section and titled it The Conservation of Emotional Capital. He imagined the self as a sovereign wealth fund whose primary asset is attention. Every reaction, every justification offered to an unworthy interlocutor is a divestment. Over time, the fund becomes depleted, and the man who once could buy silence with a glance now must borrow outrage at high interest. Therefore, the emotionally dangerous man audits his expenditures ruthlessly. He asks of every encounter, does this conversation compound my focus or dilute it? Does this relationship yield leverage or merely drama? He is not cruel in this calculus. He is simply fiduciary, To squander emotional capital on those who cannot return it with interest is not generosity, but malpractice. He wrote of environments. The average man allows his surroundings to dictate his affect. The disciplined man curates surroundings the way a museum director curates light. He chooses neutral colors for his apartment because riotous hues invite emotional reaction. He keeps books on shelves but never leaves open the ones that once made him cry. He plays music without lyrics when working, because words are Trojan horses that sneak past the guard of reason and start whispering in the native tongue of the limbic system. Even the scent of a room is calibrated. Sandalwood for reflection, bergamot for alertness. Nothing sweet that might trigger nostalgia. Nostalgia is the most insidious assassin. It dresses your wounds in sepia tones while picking the lock of your resolve. He wrote of the paradox of connection. To be emotionally dangerous is not necessarily to be alone, but it is to be selective. He described a woman he had once allowed close, not because she flattered him, but because she too practiced the art of the pause. Their conversations were sparse yet dense, like neutron stars of implication. They could sit across a cafe table for an hour and speak fewer than 50 words, yet leave with a shared strategy that would take months for others to unravel. Such connections are rare, and they are cultivated not by confession but by mutual recognition of boundaries that will never be crossed. With her, he had allowed himself one exception. He permitted her to see his notebooks, not because he trusted her. Trust is a currency too easily counterfeited, but because her mind was a whetstone against which his ideas became sharper. When the affair ended, as all affairs must, he burned the pages she had annotated. Not in anger, but in hygiene. Emotional contagion lingers in marginalia. He wrote of legacy. The emotionally dangerous man does not seek to be loved after death. He seeks to be obeyed while alive. Love is posthumous currency, useful only to heirs. Obedience is liquid, spendable daily. Therefore he trains even his ghost. He writes instructions in language that cannot be sentimentalized. He funds foundations whose bylaws are engineered to survive the decay of gratitude. He records videos that will be released only if certain betrayals occur, each message calibrated to maximize shame in the betrayer and deterrence in the observer. These are not acts of malice, but of stewardship. A man who has spent decades mastering his emotions will not allow the chaos of others to desecrate what he has built, simply because his heart has stopped. He wrote of the final threshold, the moment when emotional control ceases to be a practice and becomes identity. At this point, the man no longer monitors his reactions, the reactions monitor themselves. Anger arrives as a memo marked for review, sadness as a sealed envelope to be opened only in private. Joy is permitted brief daylight, but is never allowed to make decisions. The man becomes what the samurai aspired to, a sword that does not tremble in the hand, because the hand is no longer separate from the blade. Observers sense this change without knowing its name. They describe him as cold, but cold is merely the absence of wasted heat. They say he is heartless, but they mean only that no one has yet found the door to his heart to pick the lock. And because they cannot find it, they invent stories that he was born damaged, that he suffered some early trauma that cauterized his empathy. The stories are comforting because they preserve the myth that emotional exposure is the default setting of humanity. The truth is less dramatic. He chose a different default, and he practiced the switch until it became factory reset. He closed the notebook and placed it in the safe behind the false panel in the bookshelf. The safe also contained a passport under another name, a flash drive encrypted with market algorithms, and a photograph of a child who might or might not have been him. He spun the dial, erasing the numbers from memory as they passed. Outside, the first light of dawn was seeping into the edges of the sky, pale and uncommitted. He stood at the window and watched the city wake in increments. A delivery truck coughing to life, a jogger's reflective vest winking like a distant star, the slow brightening of windows in the building opposite as others began their daily surrender to reaction. He felt nothing in particular, which was not emptiness but fullness held in reserve. Somewhere below, a phone would soon buzz with news that would make someone else's day unravel. His would not. He had already decided what the day was for, and the day would conform to that decision or find itself discarded. He dressed with the ritual precision of a surgeon scrubbing in charcoal suit cut to eliminate any tug at the shoulders, shirt white enough to serve as surrender flag, yet starched enough to function as armor, tie the color of oxidized blood. In the elevator he watched his reflection and practiced the micro-expression of mild interest, eyebrows lifted by 2 millimeters, lips relaxed, a look that invited confidence while revealing nothing. The lobby was all marble and echo. His shoes made no sound. The doorman nodded, and he nodded back with exactly the amount of warmth that ensured continued service. Outside, the air was cool and smelled of river and exhaust. He walked 3 blocks to a cafe that opened at 5:30 and ordered espresso with no accompaniment. The barista tried small talk. He deflected with a question about the origin of the beans that flattered her expertise while ending the conversation. He sat at a corner table facing the door and opened a plain folder containing a single sheet, a list of names, each followed by a date and a contingency. The top name was circled in red. He sipped the espresso, felt the caffeine hit like a controlled explosion behind his eyes, and began to calculate the day's first silence. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, he had already won 3 quiet victories. He had not responded to an inflammatory email, had not risen to the bait of a rival's tweet, had not corrected a junior associate's mispronunciation of his surname. Each abstention was a deposit in the account that compounded into authority. He left the cafe and walked to a building whose lobby was guarded by men who knew not to greet him unless he spoke first. In the elevator he checked his reflection again. The mild interest had already been replaced by the blankness of a passport photo, a face that belonged to no particular nation of feeling. The meeting room was glass on 3 sides, a transparent cage that encouraged the illusion of vulnerability. He sat at the head of the table and waited. The others arrived in clumps, carrying laptops and anxiety in equal measure. They began to speak, to posture, to leak micro-signals of desperation disguised as strategy. He watched, timed his silences, and when he finally spoke, the temperature in the room dropped perceptibly. By the end of the hour, the circled name had been removed from the list without a single overt threat. The contingency remained unopened. He lunched alone at a restaurant where the staff knew to seat him facing a wall so that no one could read his expression over the rim of a glass. He ate half the salmon and left the rest arranged, as if he had merely paused. The waiter asked if everything was satisfactory. He replied with a single syllable that could have meant anything and therefore meant nothing. Back in his office, he stood at the window again, watching the river carry barges loaded with commodities whose value fluctuated according to emotions he no longer felt. He thought of the notebooks in the safe, of the years spent learning to write in cipher while others learned to emote in public. He thought of the photograph of the child and wondered whether emotional mastery was a staircase, ascending to freedom or descending to isolation. The question did not trouble him. It was merely a variable to be monitored. In the late afternoon he received a call from the woman who had once been allowed to see the notebooks. She spoke in the code they had developed, references to weather, to books. Neither had time to read, to mutual acquaintances who no longer mattered. The subtext was an invitation to rekindle what had never really ended, because it had never really begun. He listened without comment, then said, "I'll consider it," and hung up. The phrase was calibrated to leave a hook in her mind without committing to the catch. He deleted the call log and returned to the window. Dusk was stacking shadows on the water like poker chips. Somewhere in the city, a man was screaming at a customer service representative over a bill he could easily pay. Somewhere else, a woman was composing a text message whose subtext was "Please love me." He felt neither contempt nor pity. Both were investments he no longer made. Evening brought a reception in a museum whose marble floors were polished to a mirror finish that reflected every gown and ambition in equal clarity. He moved through the crowd like a negative space, present but uncolored by the hues of other people's needs. A senator tried to corner him with flattery. He deflected with a question about maritime law that sent the senator scrambling for an aide. A journalist attempted to provoke a quote about market volatility. He responded with a platitude so bland it would never survive editing. Each interaction was a calibration, a test of whether the mask still fit. It did. He left before the speeches began, walking out into the night where the air smelled of rain that had not yet decided to fall. On the sidewalk, a homeless man asked for change. He gave a 20 because the denomination was large enough to end the conversation quickly, and because pity was an emotion he had learned to transmute into efficiency. The man blessed him. He nodded and walked on, already erasing the encounter from the ledger of memory. Back in the apartment, he removed the tie with the same precision he had used to put it on, folding it into a rectangle whose edges aligned like a military salute. He showered in water just below scalding, letting the heat anesthetize the skin so that the mind could continue working without sensory interference. Wrapped in a robe the color of wet ash, he opened the safe and took out the notebook. On a new page he wrote, Day 372. No incidents. Enemy resources misallocated. Ally confidence reinforced. Emotional reserves at 98%. Then he added a footnote. The woman called. Probability of re-engagement 40%. Monitor for sentiment drift. He closed the book, locked the safe, and stood at the window one last time. The city was a circuit board of lights, each one a node of desire or fear or both. Somewhere in that lattice a man was learning, for the first time, that silence can be a weapon. Somewhere else a woman was discovering that her tears no longer moved the person they were meant to move. The cartographer watched without satisfaction, only the calm recognition of a system operating as designed. He turned off the lights and lay down in the dark, breathing in the lingering scent of sandalwood and strategy. In the space between one breath and the next, he rehearsed the disciplines: pause, reframe, train, harden, speak less. Then he let sleep arrive like a trusted courier bearing sealed orders for the next campaign. Outside, the rain finally began, a soft percussion against the glass that sounded, to anyone listening, like applause for a performance no one else had seen.